Chapter 1, Part 1, Training Your Sociological Eye. This is going to be the first of many Camtasia videos for this course. Chapter 1 I have split into 4 parts. This first part is going to focus almost exclusively on the concept of the sociological perspective, which is also called the sociological imagination. Part 2 addresses theory and goes over the 3 primary theoretical frameworks. Parts 3 and 4 address methodology and research methods, and specifically the steps of the research model. So to start thinking about the sociological eye, let's just do a quick thought exercise. You see here 3 scenarios. The first scenario, your significant other changes their behavior by not communicating with you as much as they did before and by seeming distracted when you all are together. Scenario 2, a person is running down the street in the middle of the day. Scenario 3, a fellow student in one of your classes repeatedly talks in class, cracks jokes, and doesn't take much notes when the instructor is teaching. For one of the scenarios, think about how you would interpret or make sense of this occurrence. Because this is what we do as human beings all day, throughout the day. We are constantly taking in phenomena, but we don't just take in this phenomena passively. Instead, we try to make sense of the world around us. Now, depending on your scenario, you maybe came up with multiple interpretations of what could be happening. So let's think now about how you came to those conclusions. You maybe indicated that you would look at other context clues. For instance, for scenario 2, is the person wearing workout clothes running down the street in the middle of the day, or are they wearing something else? Because if they're wearing workout clothes, that would lead you to assume that they're just running for exercise. But if they're wearing other types of clothes, then it would lead you to assume that there's some type of crime going on, or they are chasing down a bus, or perhaps even that they are suffering from some type of mental break. Maybe you took into account your own kind of self, your own personality, your own characteristics, your own experiences. So something like scenario 3, if you are also an extrovert who talks in class and cracks jokes, but you are still a very strong student, then you maybe would come to a very different interpretation of that scenario than a person who is more introverted and more quiet and respectful in class, who perhaps would assume that the student is not a good student or does not take the class seriously. And this idea of perspective and the fact that our own experiences and who we are can shape what we see is the concept or the idea that I would like to get started with in this lecture. Because our social location, who we are in terms of where we fall in the social structure, our gender, our race, our social class, the region that we grew up in, our religious affiliation or religiosity, all of these things comprise our social location. And for some scenarios, our social location definitely can influence what we see, what we notice, what we don't see, what we don't notice in a scenario. And given the fact that all of us can have very unique and differentiated social locations, this can be really impactful when trying to understand what is going on in the social world. And this is how this relates to the discipline of sociology, because this goal of trying to understand society and human behavior is taking into account that our own experiences and our own perspectives of society can be very influenced by our social location. And we will talk about how to address this or overcome this in later lectures as we talk about, objectivity and, the primary goals of the research model. But for this lecture, we are going to lean into this idea that there is this relationship between you, the individual, and larger society by considering the concept of the sociological perspective. Because sociology is certainly not the only social science that studies the social world, in this objective, systematic fashion. I mean, that's pretty much the goal of all the social sciences, although their focuses differ. So, if it's not the research model that makes sociology unique, from the other social sciences, what does? And that raises the question of the sociological perspective. What is this? And who among us thinks that we have it? In order to really understand the sociological perspective, which some people also call the sociological eye, and some people also call the sociological imagination, you need to grasp the idea that there is a bidirectional relationship between individuals and society. So society has an impact on us. It influences us. It affects us. Our opportunities, our options. It gives us certain barriers and constraints. But then we as individuals also have an impact on society as well. We contribute to society, we shape society, and we have the ability to change society, which is what, 15, 16 weeks from now, which is where that's the chapter that we will be ending on, right? This idea that none of this is written in stone and we can change it. So there is this bidirectional relationship between society and the individual. And not all of us necessarily, are open to this idea that society has an impact on us. Sometimes people say, I'm captain of my ship, I'm master of my own fate, and that type of agency. Sociology doesn't argue that you don't have agency, but it does argue that that agency does exist in an environment that is established by the society you live in, so that you have certain opportunities, and at the same time you have certain constraints, and people are more or less open to this idea. What we have found is there are at least two types of situations where people can clearly see the role that society has in shaping their individual lives. One of those situations is when people live on the edge of society, or where people are what we call marginal. And a person can be marginalized due to their social class. They can be marginalized due to their race, ethnicity, their nationality, immigration status. They can be marginalized, due to their gender. All of this kind of suggests when you kind of fall outside of, what society considers to be normative or what society considers to be ideal, you can be ignored and overlooked, and cut out in such a way that it allows you the perspective to be able to kind of see society a lot more clearly, than people who are more smoothly integrated in it, people that are much more involved within the society. And the other situation in which people can kind of clearly see how society shapes their individual lives is during periods of crisis. When society is kind of going through that period of change, or, when norms are and values are kind of shifting almost overnight. Or your status within society is kind of shifting and changing at a very rapid pace. People can kind of clearly see in that situation just how large of an impact society can have. The kind of most recent kind of example of this would be during the Great Recession, right? People who had never been unemployed before found themselves unemployed. People lost their homes, and everything. And for some people, it was the first time that they maybe truly, really considered the role that larger social factors play in things like your ability to get a job, or to get a good job, or to have to rely on government for existence. They perhaps maybe had misconceptions or stereotypes about people who experienced these types of things in the past. But during that period of crisis where so many Americans for the first time found themselves in this situation, they perhaps embraced the fact for the first time that you as an individual can't necessarily always control 100% of the things that are happening in your life. And this idea, that people need to be able to understand just what is under their control and what is not necessarily fully under control, is not a new idea. The concept of the sociological imagination, which is one conception of the sociological perspective, which was put forth by C. Wright Mills in 1959 during a speech and a essay that he wrote, a speech that he gave. He was the American Sociological Association president, and sociology as a discipline was kind of going through this period of being a little uncertain about, what set them apart from some of the older, more established, more popular social sciences. So, as the president of the ASA, C. Wright Mills wanted to motivate people, wanted to kind of think about a football coach giving a stirring halftime speech to amp up his team. So in this case, the team were sociologists themselves, and so he gave this piece where he presented this idea of the sociological imagination, and he was like, this is the viewpoint, this is the perspective that we teach people in our discipline, and if they are taught this perspective, they are able to understand the relationship between social history, what is going on in larger society at that time period, and their own personal biography. So they're able to understand how much of their own life has been shaped by the society at the time at which they are living in. So someone like myself, I'm African American, I'm female, I'm single. The opportunities that I have, the things that I do in my life in regards to both my professional and my personal life, are shaped by the fact that I am an 80s baby who went to school in the college in the early aughts, and I now live during this this time period. I'm middle age at 2020. This is different than my own mother, who was born, in the 50s and went to school in the 70s. And her life and what was the opportunities that were available to her and the constraints that she had. She went to segregated schools up until her senior year of high school. She was able to take advantage of the fact that colleges during the late 70s started this push for African American students, which is what allowed her to, go to UNC Chapel Hill. The opportunities that she had in her life were different than the ones that her mother experienced, who, being born in the 20s, and coming of age in the early 40s. This was a time period in the South where it was Jim Crow period. The whites only and black only lunch counters, and her opportunities both in education and the professional world were very different than what me and my mother experienced. And a lot of those opportunities have nothing to do with things like how smart we are, or how hardworking we are, or how ambitious we are. It has to do with the intersection of our lives and what is going on in society at this time. What policies have been passed, what types of discriminations exist, or, have been addressed through policy. And see, right, Mills is like, that is important. People being able to understand that, being able to have that sociological imagination is important. And one of the reasons why this is important, because it allows them to distinguish between what he calls troubles versus issues. Troubles are personal problems. These and issues are larger public matters. So let's talk a little bit more about those concepts. So, troubles, what might be some of those things that are existing in your life as a trouble? This would be something that, affects you, affects people in your circle, and it might be something that is really problematic for you. Perhaps you've been recently dumped. Perhaps you are struggling to make ends meet. Perhaps you are looking for a job and you can't find one. So take a moment to think about some troubles you might be experiencing in your life. Issues are basically the problems that society as a whole is confronting. So these are things that affect larger numbers of people in society. So homelessness is a issue in society. The climate crisis, climate change is an issue in society. Poverty is an issue in society, and there are many more social issues. So think about some issues. What you think the most important issues are that our society as a whole is confronting. All right, to complicate this a little further, let's consider whether a trouble can also be an issue. Whether a trouble can be an issue. And the answer here is obviously yes, right? If enough people within a society are experiencing this trouble, or if the consequences of this trouble have a larger social consequence or impact, then this isn't just a personal trouble, it is a larger social issue. So, one unhappy couple, struggling and considering divorce is a trouble. But if you look at divorce rates as a whole in our society, then that is suggestive of the fact that this is, in fact, a issue. A person losing his or her job might just be a trouble. But if this goes along with larger unemployment trends, because maybe your job has been downsized, or maybe it's been relocated to another country, or maybe you're being replaced by technology, all of this is suggestive of something larger, in which case unemployment is a social issue. An individual student having problems paying for college is a trouble. But given what we know about the rising cost of college, at the same time, wages have not increased at that rate. So many students go into take out student loans in order to be able to afford college, so that they can take advantage of professional opportunities, but then they struggle to pay these loans back. The student loan debt crisis is a social issue. So, really, the best way to kind of think about this is that while all troubles are not issues, if you're struggling to like potty train your dog or your toddler, that's not necessarily an issue. But certainly, all issues are someone's troubles, right? Something could not exist as an issue if it did not exist in a large number of people's lives as also being a trouble. So let's kind of just work through this together, and consider something like obesity. So, what is obesity? Obesity is actually a very specific term based on an equation used to establish your BMI, your body mass index. And if your body mass index is over 30, and the equation uses, your height and your weight. If your body mass index is over 30, we consider that to be obese. Now, Obesity in America, this gives you a sense of prevalence back about a decade ago. You can kind of see that although there are some small distinctions in race and in gender and in income, um, that to a certain extent, large numbers of people in this country, in most cases over one third of different demographic groups, are what we would consider to be obese. And if you look at this kind of changing map of the United States, you can see that the prevalence of obesity among U.S. adults changed dramatically in really just a 6 year time period. You can see more and more states where larger increasing number of their population reported that they were obese. So all of this suggests, that just given the sheer number of people that we are talking about, that obesity, although it feels like a very personal problem or trouble, actually because it impacts so many people's lives, could be considered a social issue. Um, Another reason why we consider obesity a social issue is if we think about kind of the reasons why people are obese. So, certainly, there are many reasons that can contribute to someone being obese. One of which is genetics. We do know that people have what is just kind of called a set point, a kind of weight that their body likes to be. And for some of people, that weight is higher than other people. Although the International Journal of Obesity has kind of determined that only about 25% of our obesity prevalence is explained by genetics. So most of it is explained by non genetic factors. And this is where it becomes a little bit more sociological. So, one set of factors contributing to obesity deals with lifestyle. How active are you and what is your diet? And although that might seem very personal, right? Like you make a decision to, eat certain things, you make a decision, whether or not you are active. This also can become very sociological. We know that with something like activity, that many things that are beyond a person's individual control can influence activity, like their work schedule, the availability of green spaces, whether or not they live in neighborhoods that are safe and well lit and with sidewalks that will allow them to do something like walk at night. That for most people, gym memberships are not covered by their health insurance, even if and that's if they have health insurance. So their ability to kind of pay for, workouts and workout equipment if they want to work out at home. So it goes beyond just whether or not a person wants to be active. There are some kind of social, larger societal influences there as well. And this is even more true with diet, because people's ability to afford fresh foods, be able to access fresh foods, buy fresh foods, is influenced by how much money they make, whether or not they are dependent on government assistance in the form of, SNAP or WIC, whether they live in an area that has accessible grocery stores, and to what extent do those grocery stores, stock healthy food, fresh fruits and vegetables, lean meats. There are people that live in parts of the country that have been established what we call food deserts, meaning that there are not sufficient opportunities for them to be able to shop at grocery stores that carry these types of items. And that in this case, they might find themselves relying on what is stocked by just a small corner store, or what is is stopped by like a gas station. And of course, if people lack transportation and live in an area where that lacks mass transit, this also impacts their ability to buy healthy food. Fast food has become much more common as our lives have gotten faster pace. More and more people need both partners to work, and working hours have increased for most Americans. So there is this increased reliance on being able to eat out, and with the cost associated with eating out, oftentimes what people can afford, and once again, in some cases, the only thing that is available in the area that they live in might be these types of McDonald's and Burger King options where the food is not very healthy. And so, once again, just kind of emphasizing, yes, people still make their personal individual decisions about whether or not to work out and what to eat, but those decisions are shaped, they are constrained by the environment that they live in, and that is social. The kind of final set of risk behaviors are social, in the sense that, it speaks to the people that you surround you with, the culture you're born into, and maybe the messages that they give you about the role of food and diet in your life, or what they suggest about what type of body type is ideal. So people have social influences that also can contribute to the likelihood that they are obese. And so, all of this, both the number of people, the prevalence of obesity in this country, the social influences that contribute to obesity, is why we consider this an issue and not just a trouble. The final set of reasons why we consider obesity an issue and not just a trouble have to do with the consequences of obesity. And so, there are well established links between obesity and an increased risk of developing a wide range of diseases, some of which are chronic, some of which are acute. Things like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, osteoarthritis, coronary heart disease, stroke, asthma, sleep apnea. There's been more recent evidence that suggests that obesity can be a factor for a variety of cancers. And for this reason, behind tobacco smoking, we do consider overweight and being obese as being kind of the second most preventable cause of death in this country. And, obviously, if you get sick, if you get a disease, if you die, all of these things have individual consequences, but it has larger social consequences as well. When a large number of our population is not living their most healthy or optimal lives, this impacts our workforce, our labor force, which impacts, of course, our tax base. When people are unhealthy, especially as they age, this increase our healthcare costs as we provide Medicaid and Medicare to individuals. If people die earlier than we expect them to, once again, this kind of depletes our labor force and depletes our tax base. So all of this speaks to kind of some of why even the kind of health consequences of obesity have a social have kind of a social context. But then there are certainly social consequences of obesity as well. We know from research that people that are overweight and obese are more likely to experience weight discrimination, which can lead to people being less likely to hire them or promote them. This is especially true for women, even more so than men. So there is this link between being obese and unemployed or underemployed. We know that there is what we call fat stigmatization, where there is this stigma associated being with overweight and obese, and this can impact people's mental health, as well as just their opportunities to fully participate in larger social life and social settings. Um, and certainly, there are plenty of people that we are starting to see with a rise in the body positivity movement, that really make the point that it is this fat stigmatization of obesity that is more consequential and more impactful than even necessarily the health risk, as people can potentially be obese and still be healthy, provided that they are engaging in healthy behaviors like exercise and eating the right types of foods. And so, if that is true, if that is the case, that fat stigmatization certainly is social in nature, and is rooted in society's prejudices and stereotypes, and isn't just kind of a individual experience. And so, this walking you through this example is really just to kind of show you how sociologists think when they use the sociological perspective or imagination. We don't just point the finger at individuals and say it's your fault that you're obese, it's your fault that you're poor, it's your fault that you did not pursue higher education. As sociologists, we always kind of take a step back, and before we assume that something is a trouble, we really make sure, that it isn't in fact social in nature, that it isn't a social issue we are dealing with, because troubles can be much more easily addressed at the individual level, while issues, because they are larger and societal in nature, they in order to address them, it goes beyond the individual, and people are sometimes very uncomfortable with this, and there's something called the fallacy of the individualistic perspective, and this fallacy is very common in America because we're such an individualistic nation. This idea that everything is the fault of the individual. And if everything is the fault of the individual, then of course everything can in fact be fixed by the individual. You just need to fill in the blank, right? And in sociology, we really try to push back against that perspective. And that's because there is what we call, depending on your stance, the two core commitments or the two core contradictions. Now, sociologists agree on the first here, that we use the sociological eye, perspective, imagination to understand and analyze how society works. Where sociologists sometimes disagree is what we then do with that knowledge. What do we do with that information once we gain it? For people who are pro reform, the second commitment is that you then take action. If we know that people's lives are shaped by these social issues that they cannot fully control and they cannot fully fix, then we as a society need to be more proactive in our efforts to improve or reform society. However, some people feel like that this is contradictory to the goals of being a social scientist, emphasis on the word scientist, right? Where the main focus just needs to be on obtaining the truth and gaining the information, and that we should not be so strident and proactive in trying to fix society. And they often point to the fact that that for a lot of other sciences, physical sciences and social scientists, that they don't necessarily advocate for reform to the same extent that a lot of sociologists do. And whether or not you are a whether or not you see it as a necessity that we reform society, or whether or not you see it as a bad thing that there is this push for reform, probably is going to influence your answer to this question about how to address rising rates of obesity. Because if you are pro reform, you're probably going to suggest a lot of things that have to happen on the larger societal level. So maybe more money be dedicated to putting in street lights and sidewalks and green spaces, that health insurance be required to cover nutritionists and dietitians and gym memberships, that PE be provided in schools and daycare, or that children team sports be provided free of charge in order to address the rising rates of child obesity. All of those things are policy driven, and to be honest, all of those things require money, so they also require taxes. And so if you are a reformist, you are more likely to point your finger there. If you don't necessarily think it should be the job of sociologists to suggest reforms, you probably are going to answer this question in a different way, or perhaps not even answer it at all. And so, this part of your text, kind of ends with discussing, in sociology, there is an established tradition of some sociologists being analysis, not reform. This would be people like Herbert Spencer, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, Talcott Parsons. And then there are people that are very much pro analysis and reform: Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Jane Addams, and most of the other early female sociologists, W.E.B. Du Bois, and C. Wright Mills. You will see some of these names again as we learn more about them throughout this course. But just know that even in today's world, the role of sociology is still debated. There are people that push for what we call basic sociology. And this is where you just analyze society and you publish your findings in books and sociology journals that are primarily read by other people in the discipline or students in the discipline. And then there is applied sociology. This is the pro-reform wing. And people who are applied sociologists, they actively try to use sociology and their sociological research to solve problems in society. And then there's public sociology, which is right there in the middle. And for public sociologists, they don't necessarily push reform or actively apply their research themselves, but they publish and make their research available beyond the academic sector in hopes that other people, whether they are nonprofit leaders or teachers or school principals or police chiefs, right, that their sociological research will be accessible to those people in such a way that they can use what we have found out about the world in order to perhaps make the world a better place. And that is it for part one. As I said, part two is going to pick up by discussing where theory comes into play in all of this, and focusing specifically on our three primary theoretical frameworks.